I'm Joanne Rogers, Fred's wife, and I just want to tell you that I am thrilled.
The man the whole world trusted with their children was hiding something shocking. This was not just tattoos, confirmed kills, or a secret life as a Navy SEAL. What Fred Rogers was actually hiding was far more complicated than any internet rumor ever managed to capture. Before she died at 92, his widow, Joanne Rogers, spent years telling anyone who would listen the real truth about the man behind the cardigan. And what she revealed was not the saint the world had built in its memory. What did Joanne Rogers know that the rest of the world had completely missed? Join us as we reveal the awful truth she revealed about Fred Rogers, the rumor that followed him into the grave. Let us start with the lie, because the lie is the thing that started every conversation about the real Fred Rogers. At some point in the late 1990s, an email began circulating across the internet. It described Fred Rogers, the soft-spoken man in the cardigan sweater who spent 30 years talking to children about their feelings, as a decorated military killer. The email claimed that before the neighborhood trolley and the land of make-believe, before Daniel Tiger and King Friday, and all those songs about being special, Fred Rogers had been a United States Navy SEAL with over 25 confirmed kills in Vietnam. The sweaters, the email explained, were covering full-sleeve tattoos, one tattoo for every person he had killed. The story spread the way all great lies spread, quickly, widely, and with the particular energy that comes from something that feels too outrageous to ignore. People forwarded it to their friends. Kids whispered it to each other at school. Adults repeated it at dinner tables with the conspiratorial delight of someone who has just learned that everything they thought they knew was wrong. The internet was still young enough that people had not yet developed the instinct to check things before sharing them, and the story found an enormous receptive audience. The United States Navy eventually issued a formal correction addressing the rumor directly, pointing out two things that made the story impossible. Fred Rogers was born in 1928, making him too old to have served in Vietnam, and he had no gaps in his career during which military service could have occurred. He went straight from college to television work, with breaks taken only to attend Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Child Development. The timeline left no room for a secret military career, and the physical records were even more definitive. Rogers registered for the draft in 1948, reported for a physical examination in 1950, and was classified 4F, meaning he was declared unfit for military service for reasons that were never publicly specified. The screenwriters of A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the 2019 Tom Hanks film, eventually traced the origin of the myth to a real man named Fred Rogers, who was a Marine sharpshooter and who briefly put up a website called fredrogers.com for his security business before taking it down. The website was discovered, the name was matched to the famous one, and a completely fictional biography was born and set loose in the world. The journalist Tom Junod, whose Esquire magazine profile of Fred Rogers inspired the film, confirmed the definitive physical evidence personally. He went swimming with Rogers one morning and saw for himself that there were no tattoos anywhere on the man's body. Joanne Rogers never dignified the military rumor with extended public comment. She did not need to. The facts had already settled the question completely. But the rumor's existence mattered, because it pointed to something real about how the world was relating to her husband. People could not quite accept that he was exactly what he appeared to be. That is where the more important, more uncomfortable truths began to surface. And if the lie about Fred Rogers being a soldier was easy to disprove, what were the truths that Joanne spent years trying to get the world to understand that were considerably harder to swallow? Fred Rogers wasn't a saint either, Joanne Rogers had one request when the 2018 documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor was being made. Just one. She asked the filmmaker Morgan Neville not to present her husband as a saint. She had watched the world turn Fred Rogers into something untouchable and unreachable after his death in 2003, and she understood exactly how damaging that transformation was, not just to his memory, but to the message he had spent 30 years trying to deliver. She told the Los Angeles Times that her biggest concern about the documentary was that Fred would come across as someone way above all the rest of us, someone so extraordinary that ordinary people would look at him and say they could never do what he did. The exact thing she was trying to protect against was the idea that his kindness was some kind of superpower that regular humans simply did not possess. Because if people believed that, they would use it as an excuse. They would look at the kindness he showed every single day to every single person he encountered and say, well, that is Fred Rogers, and Fred Rogers was special, and I am not Fred Rogers, so what am I supposed to do about it? Her answer to that question was direct and simple and repeated in every interview she gave in the years after his death. You can do it. There are lots of Fred Rogers out there. What he did was not magic, and it was not the product of some rare gift that most people were born without. It was the product of daily, intentional, sometimes exhausting work. And that work, she was insistent about this point, was genuinely hard. Fred Rogers worked literally from the time he got up in the morning until he went to bed at night, always thinking about what he was working on, always preparing, always doing multiple drafts of even a single speech up until the moment he delivered it. The archive at the Fred Rogers Center contains the physical evidence of that process. Draft after draft after draft of speeches and scripts, each one slightly different, each one reaching for the most precise and honest version of what he was trying to say. The ease and warmth that came across on screen was the finished product of an enormous amount of behind-the-scenes labor that the audience never saw and was never meant to see. Bill Eisler, the longtime president of Fred Rogers Productions, confirmed the same thing in interviews after Joanne's death. Fred had high expectations for himself and high expectations for the people working alongside him. He was not a passive, endlessly forgiving presence in a professional context. He knew what he wanted, he worked relentlessly to achieve it, and he expected the same commitment from the people around him. The gentle voice and the slow pace of the television show were the deliberate choices of someone who understood exactly what children needed from a screen. They were not a reflection of a personality that had no edge to it. The truth Joanne was trying to tell was not that Fred Rogers was secretly cruel or secretly difficult. It was that the image of him as a perfectly serene, effortlessly kind being was both false and harmful. He was a human being who struggled with depression his whole life, who had been bullied as an overweight child and carried the memory of that pain into adulthood, who used his puppets, including the anxious and vulnerable Daniel Striped Tiger, to process his own most private feelings in a way that the outside world could receive as entertainment. The puppet that most resembled Fred Rogers himself was not the confident King Friday or the cheerful Lady Aberlin. It was the small, frightened, uncertain tiger who needed constant reassurance that he was worth something. But if the truth about the man behind the cardigan was complicated, what about the truth the world most desperately did not want to hear from the woman who lived with him for 50 years? What Joanne said about Fred that made people deeply uncomfortable? The most politically charged thing Joanne Rogers ever said in public was delivered in a Nightline interview in 2018 during the promotional campaign for Won't You Be My Neighbor. She confirmed something that the documentary had also mentioned. Fred Rogers was a lifelong Republican, not a complicated, ambivalent, hold-your-nose kind of Republican, but a genuine, committed one who had voted with the party throughout his adult life. Joanne Rogers made the disclosure in the same interview in which she said that whoever was leading the country at that moment had values almost completely opposite to Fred's values, and was not a forgiver in the way that forgiveness had been central to everything Fred believed. The combination of those two statements, Fred was a Republican, and the current Republican leadership would have appalled him, landed with the force of a genuine contradiction for a lot of people who heard it, and immediately tried to resolve it in the direction that confirmed whatever they already believed. For people on the left, the disclosure was confusing and unwelcome. For people on the right, the criticism of the party's current leadership felt like a betrayal of the disclosure. Joanne Rogers was not interested in managing either reaction. She was interested in telling the truth, which was that her husband had held political views that did not map neatly onto any contemporary tribal allegiance, and that attempting to conscript his memory into either camp would have made him genuinely angry. The thing that Fred Rogers cared about, Joanne said consistently and repeatedly, was reconciliation. Getting people who disagreed with each other to talk to each other, to listen to each other, to treat each other with the basic dignity that every human being deserved. That was not a left-wing idea or a right-wing idea in the way he understood it. It was a Christian idea, specifically a Presbyterian one, rooted in the ordination as a minister that he had received in 1963 and that he carried with him every single day of his professional life, even when nobody on the screen knew it was there. Joanne Rogers told interviewers that Fred would have been appalled by the country's political discourse in the years after his death, and that she herself was appalled too, using the word he would have used for a situation that violated the most fundamental principles of how human beings were supposed to treat each other. She was not a shy or diplomatic woman. She was direct, funny, warm, and completely clear about what she thought. Anyone who spent time in her presence noted that she had her own distinct personality that had nothing to do with being Mrs. Fred Rogers, a woman who had built a serious career as a concert pianist, and who had always been fully herself regardless of whose wife she happened to be. The other uncomfortable truth that Joanne addressed openly was the one that the documentary handled with more care than any other single topic: the situation of Officer Clemens, the black actor who played Officer Clemens on the show for 25 years and who was gay, and the conversation Fred Rogers had with him about not being seen at gay bars because the show could lose sponsors. That conversation had happened. Fred Rogers did say that, and Joanne Rogers did not deny it or soften it or explain it away. What she said in interviews and in her appearances at documentary screenings was that Fred eventually came fully around to accepting Clemens exactly as he was, that the friendship between the two men was real and deep and lasted beyond the show, and that the famous scene of the two of them sitting together and sharing the small backyard pool to cool their feet on a hot day was one of the most intentionally radical things the show ever did, a direct response to the segregationist practice of banning black people from public swimming pools that was still happening in America when that episode aired in 1969. What Fred Rogers did wrong, and Joanne Rogers was clear that it was wrong, was choosing the preservation of the show's sponsorships over the full public acceptance of someone he genuinely loved and respected. What he did right, and Joanne Rogers was equally clear about this, was use the platform he protected to change the way a generation of American children thought about race, disability, grief, divorce, fear, and the basic dignity of other human beings, one slow and quiet episode at a time. And if the truth about Fred Rogers, the man, was more complicated than the legend suggested, what about the truth of what it was actually like to be married to him for 50 years? Told by the only person who truly knew. Joanne Rogers met Fred Rogers at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, where they were both studying music. She remembered later that he sat right down at the piano and started playing pop music the first time she encountered him, and that she was struck immediately by who he was. She was Sarah Joanne Bird from Jacksonville, Florida, a pianist with her own serious musical ambitions and her own distinct personality. When he proposed to her after graduating, he did it in a letter because he had moved to New York for a television job and she had stayed in Florida to finish her degree. She said yes. They married in 1952 and remained married for 50 years until his death from stomach cancer in February 2003. A marriage that the people who knew them described as deeply loving and marked by a private language of shared references and sayings that had accumulated over half a century of life together. Bill Eisler described watching them together and feeling like a visitor in a world that had its own grammar, its own humor, its own set of rules that only two people who had known each other since college and built an entire life together could fully navigate. What Joanne Rogers said about what that life was actually like contained one detail that most people who heard it found genuinely surprising. Fred Rogers hated fame. The man who became one of the most recognized faces in American television, who could not walk down a street in Pittsburgh without being stopped every few feet, genuinely despised the celebrity that the work had produced. He had not set out to become famous. He had set out to reach children, to talk to them honestly about the things that scared them and confused them, to tell them they were worth something exactly as they were. The fame was a byproduct he had not wanted and did not enjoy. Joanne Rogers also addressed something that surfaced with some regularity in public discussions of Fred Rogers' life, which was the suggestion, never seriously advanced but always hovering, that a man who was as gentle and soft and emotionally expressive as Fred Rogers must have been secretly gay. She addressed this quietly and clearly in the Won't You Be My Neighbor documentary, describing their physical and emotional connection over 50 years in terms that left no room for ambiguity without making a public spectacle of a private reality. She was not defensive about it. She was simply honest, the way she was honest about everything. The night before Fred Rogers died in February 2003, after months of declining health from stomach cancer that he had largely kept private, Joanne sat with him and told him something she needed him to hear. She told him that the boys, their two sons James and John, were going to be all right, that she was going to try to be all right, that he could go. She said later in an interview that she felt he went with joy, that after the months of pain that had preceded the end, he was finally at peace and even happy. That single detail, the mother of his children sitting beside him and releasing him from the obligation to stay, is the most human and the most devastating image in the entire 50-year story of that marriage. After he was gone, Joanne Rogers spent 18 years protecting, explaining, and advocating for the legacy her husband had spent 30 years building. She helped develop the Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning and Children's Media at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, his hometown. She served as chair emerita of Fred Rogers Productions. She appeared on television, at documentary screenings, at university events, anywhere she was asked to go, doing the work of keeping the message alive and the memory accurate. She made a cameo in A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood in 2019. She appeared on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon to talk about the famous pool scene and what it had meant and what it still meant. She was funny and sharp and direct and entirely herself in every public appearance, always the woman her son Jim had described in a New York Times interview. She had always been her own person, always been Joanne Rogers as opposed to Mrs. Fred Rogers, and that distinction had never stopped being true. Joanne Rogers died on January 14, 2021, at the age of 92 in Pittsburgh, surrounded by friends and family, with no cause of death publicly disclosed by the family. Fred Rogers. Productions described her as a joyful and tender-hearted spirit whose laughter and kindness would be deeply missed. The Fred Rogers Center called her a trusted anchor, whose heart and wisdom had guided their work in service of Fred's enduring legacy. The city of Pittsburgh called her one of its favorite neighbors, the same language Fred had used every single day for 30 years when he walked through his television front door and asked the most important question anyone ever asked on American television. Do you think the world is better served by the saint version of a Fred Rogers or by the real one? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.